Hi, everyone.
Hello again. In Genesis chapter 41, Joseph is risen to power because he has these extraordinary prophetic gifts that the leaders of Egypt, including Pharaoh, cannot but relate to God.
Mm-hmm.
Whether it's a God or gods or the true God,
Mm-hmm.
Pharaoh recognizes this is something nobody else has.
And he's been given a wife in Egypt,
Yeah.
an Egyptian wife.
Now we're going to see he has sons.
Mm-hmm.
And even in the names of those sons is prophetic significance as well as a testimony to his faith at this point,
Mm-hmm.
and how he sees the relationship between suffering and fruitfulness. So we'll get to that in a minute. Here's the passage, though. This is talking about this is the end of 41, starting at verse 46.
Mm-hmm.
Joseph was 30 years old when he entered the service of Pharaoh, king of Egypt. And Joseph went out from the presence of Pharaoh and went through all the land of Egypt. During the 7 plentiful years the earth produced abundantly, and he gathered up all the food of these 7 years, which occurred in the land of Egypt, and put the food in the cities. He put in every city the food from the fields around it. And Joseph stored up grain in great abundance, like the sand of the sea, until he ceased to measure it, for it could not be measured. Before the year of famine came, 2 sons were born to Joseph. Asenath, the daughter of Potipharah, priest of On, bore them to him. Joseph called the name of the firstborn Manasseh, for he said, God has made me forget all my hardship and all my father's house. The name of the second he called Ephraim, for God has made me fruitful in the land of my affliction.
Then the 7 years of plenty, which were in the land of Egypt, ended, and the 7 years of famine began to come, as Joseph had said. The famine was in all the lands, but in all the land of Egypt there was bread. So when all the land of Egypt was famished, the people cried to Pharaoh for bread. Then Pharaoh said to all the Egyptians, Go to Joseph. Whatever he says to you, do. The famine was over all the face of the earth, and Joseph opened all the storehouses and sold to the Egyptians. And the famine became severe in the land of Egypt. So all the countries came to Joseph in Egypt to buy grain, because the famine was severe in all lands.
I think we should remark again upon Joseph's use of the names, even in private here. We don't know he's telling Egyptians about this yet. But when he names his 2 sons, God has made me forget all my hardship, and God has made me fruitful.
Mm-hmm.
Why does he say God and not Yahweh or Jehovah, as we would?
Mm-hmm.
And it could relate to what we've already said in a prior video or two, namely that he is aware that he's distant from God now, in the sense he's out of the land. And
Away from his people.
The name Yahweh has something to do with the promises, and that includes, of course, the land promise centrally, but also with the closeness, the covenant relationship that you share in with the people of the land, the people of God.
Yeah.
And he's now distant from the people of God.
Yeah.
So we can't be absolutely sure how he felt about that, but we do note that in all these chapters, right up to Jacob's deathbed, in chapter 49, we're reading Elohim constantly. We're never seeing Yahweh, Jehovah.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think the other thing that I noted was those 2 names of the boys. Not just the fact that he doesn't use God's name, but he connects, or he's obviously been put in a position where he's got luxury in his life now.
Mm-hmm.
He's got fine clothes and power and position, and yet he still feels afflicted, and he still is a slave.
Yeah.
I think that's something that you forget sometimes. He's still under Pharaoh. He can't just not do what Pharaoh says. So he still feels affliction. But he also seems to feel God has given him some fruitfulness during that affliction. So I thought in terms of our life, I still miss my family. So I still feel the affliction of being separated from my family. But I do think God has helped us to be fruitful in our life.
Yeah.
That was possible, and perhaps even part of the reason we were able to be fruitful was because of going through that suffering. It makes you more empathetic to people.
It makes you
and
want
their
to help
sufferings.
people going through the same thing.
That's right.
And more able to do it.
Yeah, I think it makes you more qualified and more sympathetic and understanding.
Sure.
When you're dealing with people who are suffering. So I'm grateful for that, although I still feel the same pain of being separated from the family.
Of course. So this connection between hardship and affliction and fruitfulness, though something you wouldn't normally think about, because we all want prosperity and happiness. But I couldn't help but think of the text in John 12, verse 24, where Christ says, unless a grain falls to the ground and dies, it will not bear fruit.
Yeah.
And also the passage in a couple of chapters later, right? John 15, about the vine, where he says, unless you abide in me, you can bear no fruit. You have no life in you.
And then it talks about pruning the vine
but the Father,
in order to make it more fruitful.
Yeah, the Father's going to prune even the vine, even the branches that are bearing fruit. He's going to prune them so that they can bear more fruit.
Yeah.
So there's the role of suffering, and Christ, of course, is very qualified to talk about this.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And you had a quote from...
Yeah. This is James Strong, and this is a book that's been in more or less constant reprint since it was published 120 years ago. It's called Hebrew Ideals in Genesis. This is page 304. There is the very spirit of romance in the idea of the transformation of the dreamy Hebrew boy into the keen, bold Egyptian governor, the greatest statesman of his time. So others have risen. David rose from the sheepcote to be the greatest king of his time. Elisha from the plow to be the greatest prophet of his time. Peter from the fishing boat to be the greatest apostle of his time. Luther from the miner's hut to be the greatest reformer of his time. Bunyan from the tinker's kitchen to be the greatest seer of his time. Livingston from the weaver's loom to be the greatest missionary of his time. Lincoln from the tanner's yard to be the greatest statesman of his time. The age of romance has not ceased. It never ceases. It does not, if we think of it, so much as very sensibly decline. And that's all a quote apparently from Thomas Carlyle, the great writer of that period, in his book about heroes, perhaps. But the noblest of those, this is Strong now, but the noblest of those whose names have been inscribed on the temple of fame have not sought for fame. They have simply done the will of God, loved their fellow men, and honor has been thrust upon them.
That's nice.
Certainly true of Joseph.
Yeah. And so we were going to link to a video, Vivian's Tears.
And what's that about?
That's based on a scripture that used to always make me cry every time I started reading it, Romans 3.
Romans 9.
Romans 9, sorry. Yeah.
Why did it make you cry?
Oh, you're going to make me cry.
No.
No, it's because Paul talks about the Hebrew people and says that he wished he could save them rather than himself. So, his feelings towards his people was what I felt for Jehovah's Witnesses.
And your family.
Yeah.
So he's talking about his brethren according to the flesh, the nation of Israel, who had rejected Messiah.
Yeah. So we'll link to that.
See shortly.